Press one finger into the soil at the base of your biggest tomato plant. Do it right now, before the next hot day arrives and makes the choice for you. Push until you feel moisture. How far did your finger go before it felt damp? 2 centimeters? 3? Because if that is the answer, your tomato's roots are living and dying in the same thin layer of soil that July will turn into an oven in one single afternoon. Here is what nobody ever told you clearly. The plant will look completely fine. Green leaves, fruit setting, everything looking like it is working. You are out there every morning with your watering can, faithful as a clock, doing what feels like proper care. And underground, in a zone you cannot see and would never think to check, the roots your tomato needs to survive heat are quietly being trained to stay exactly where they will be killed. The fix costs nothing. It asks only that you put the can down for 4 days. But that knowledge simply never made it onto any label, any store display, or any garden center advice card. Because nobody sells 4 days of not watering. You are not to blame for this. The way that tomatoes are sold, planted, and talked about in every garden shop pushes you toward daily watering, without ever explaining why that is wrong. Seed packets tell you to water regularly. Transplant tags say keep moist. None of those instructions mention that regularly and moist, applied daily with a small can, trains your tomato's roots to stay in the top 3 to 7 centimeters of soil, which is precisely the zone that a July heat wave destroys in a single afternoon. The people who wrote those instructions were not lying. They were selling seeds and transplants, not root biology. Think back for a moment. Was there a tomato plant in your grandfather's or grandmother's garden that was simply bigger, fuller, and heavier with fruit than anything you have grown? And did that person seem to water it less than you do? Less fussing, less daily trips, just a thorough soaking every few days, and then leaving it alone? If yes, that person understood something about roots that nobody bothered to write on a package. Here is what you will understand by the end of this. You will know exactly what happens underground when you water daily, the biological reason roots stay shallow, and why that is a death sentence when summer heat peaks. You will hear the story of an engineer who discovered the principle behind deep root training by accident in a farmer's yard, decades before the science could explain what he had seen. You will understand the specific signal inside your tomato plant that either steers roots downward toward safety or leaves them stranded near the surface. And you will have a 5-step protocol you can start tomorrow morning. No products to buy, no tools you do not already own, just a different way of using the same water you already carry out to the garden. But there is one mistake you need to hear about before the protocol, because it is the thing that makes the whole method work in reverse when you do it. This mistake looks exactly like attentiveness. It feels like good care. It is what every well-meaning gardener does when they switch to deep watering and then panic at the first sign of stress. The plant sends you a signal. You respond the way your instincts say is correct, and within 10 days, you have undone everything the protocol was building. Stay to the end. That is where the full explanation lives. Now look at what your daily watering routine has actually cost you this season, measured in real terms. Every morning trip to the garden with a small can takes 10 to 15 minutes of your time. Do that 120 days across a growing season, and you have spent between 20 and 30 hours of your summer carrying water back and forth. 3 full working days of your life, given to a habit that was not only unnecessary, but was working against the plant the entire time. That is the smallest cost of the 3. Water evaporation from bare, warm soil in peak summer hours means that a significant portion of what you pour on the surface at midday never reaches 5 centimeters depth. It vanishes into the air before the roots below can use it, and the surface looks dark for 40 minutes before drying again. On a hot July afternoon, bare soil can lose 30 to 50% of surface-applied water through evaporation alone before a single drop penetrates to root level. You pour faithfully, and the sun takes most of it. The wet surface around your plant is also where disease starts. Tomatoes kept with a constantly moist surface are 3.5 times more likely to develop fungal infections, early blight, late blight, Pythium root rot, than plants watered deeply and allowed to dry between sessions. A single round of fungicide treatment costs between $15 and $40, and bad seasons require 3 or 4 applications before you give up. Add that to your time investment, and the daily watering habit has generated a disease bill on top of everything else, while the harvest it was supposed to protect shrinks anyway. The comparison runs like this. Deep watering, 4 to 5 liters per plant, twice a week across 16 weeks of the season, uses roughly the same total water as your daily routine, sometimes less. The labor drops to about 10 to 11 hours for the whole season, which is half what you spend now. And the yield difference in research trials runs between 20 and 35% more tomatoes from the same plant, same soil, same seed. Have you ever finished a season wondering why it felt like a bad year when the weather seemed fine? You are now looking at one strong answer to that question. The question underneath all of this is the one that should make you pause. If this is so simple and the results are so consistent, why did no one ever tell you? There is a real answer to that question, and it traces back to one man who found the principle not in a laboratory, but in a farmer's yard, and nearly watched the knowledge disappear entirely. But before the story, a scene you need to picture. It is the end of June. You have just learned about deep watering and switched your approach. The tomatoes look excellent after the first 2 deep soakings. Then, a stretch of hot days arrives, temperatures climbing to 30 or 32 degrees for 5 days in a row. On the 3rd afternoon, you go out to the garden and see the leaves curling slightly. Your instinct fires immediately. The plant needs water. You give it a small top-up from the can. Then another small one the next afternoon. Then another because the leaves curl again at 2 in the afternoon. Within 10 days, you are back to daily shallow watering without noticing it. The roots are back at the surface, the gradient that was pulling them down has collapsed, and the next real heat wave takes the plant down. You would not have known that the curling you saw was not drought at all. The real mistake, and how to tell the difference, is coming. Read to the end. In the early 1930s, a Polish-born water engineer named Simcha Blas was working on water supply problems in what was then British-controlled Palestine. He was not a botanist. He was not a gardener. He was an engineer who thought in terms of pipes and gradients and where water goes when it moves through soil. One day, on a farm outside the city, he noticed a single large tree standing noticeably taller and greener than everything around it. Fuller canopy, darker leaves, thriving in conditions where neighboring trees were struggling or dead. The surrounding soil looked the same. The rainfall was the same. Blas stopped and looked more carefully, and then he dug. At depth, below where the roots should have been stopping, he found an old iron pipe fitting with a slow, persistent drip. The fitting had been leaking underground for years, releasing water not at the surface, but deep in the soil, below where the sun could evaporate it. The tree's roots had followed that moisture downward, year after year, building a root architecture that extended far below the reach of any drought. The surface could bake dry for weeks, and the tree never noticed, because its roots were drawing from a layer of soil where the sun had no authority.
Blas was an engineer, and he recognized immediately what he was looking at. This was not a botanical accident. This was a demonstration of a principle. Water delivered below the surface, slowly and at depth, trains roots to go down and stay down. Water delivered at the surface trains roots to stay where the heat will kill them. The tree proved it in the most direct way possible. He spent the next 2 decades turning that observation into a working system.
In 1959, he installed the first experimental below-surface drip irrigation setup on agricultural land in the Negev desert, demonstrating on crops what the tree had shown him on its own. In 1964, he partnered with a farming cooperative to form what would become the world's first commercial drip irrigation company, with initial product sales beginning in 1967. Every friction-slowing emitter Blas designed was built around the same principle as that leaking pipe fitting. Release water slowly, below the surface, so the moisture front forms at depth and the roots follow it down, rather than staying near the surface where summer will kill them. The company he co-founded grew into a global operation, and the technology is now used on millions of hectares of farmland around the world. But the core insight never changed from what a single dripping pipe joint taught him in a farmer's yard in the 1930s. Here is the piece that sharpens the story. The agricultural extension offices in the region during the 1950s and 1960s were not hostile to Blas. They were simply uninterested. The government agricultural programs of the era were organized around chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, soil amendments, because those inputs came from suppliers with distribution networks and budgets for demonstration days and field representatives. A technique that required no purchase, no product, and no repeat sales had no mechanism for reaching farmers at scale. When Blas presented his early drip irrigation results to regional agricultural committees in the late 1950s, the response was not rejection so much as indifference. The yields were interesting, but there was nothing to sell, and therefore nothing to promote. The farmers who would have benefited most from knowing about root training were never told, because no one in the supply chain had a reason to tell them. An independent confirmation arrived a decade later and thousands of miles away in the Central Valley of California in the 1970s. Agricultural researcher James Harrington, working at a state university extension station near Fresno, was measuring where tomato roots went depending on how and where water was delivered, with no knowledge of Blas's work. His data showed the same thing the dripping pipe had demonstrated decades earlier. Roots concentrated at the depth of the water source, and plants with roots drawn down to 30 or 40 centimeters showed dramatically better survival in heat stress periods than plants confined to the top 10 centimeters. His report was filed and circulated among university colleagues and largely ignored by the commercial agricultural community for the same structural reason. There was nothing to sell from it. Give a thumbs up for Simcha Blas. He found the answer before the science existed to name it, built a working system around it, and the principle he demonstrated is now confirmed down to the molecular level. He deserved that recognition. Now, let's go underneath the soil, because this is where your plant either lives through July or doesn't. Inside your tomato plant, there is a navigation system for finding water, a built-in signal that activates when the upper soil dries and moisture exists deeper down. Scientists recently confirmed the specific gene that drives this response, using precision gene editing tools to disable it and observe what happened. Roots in plants with the intact gene bent nearly 79 degrees toward a water source in just 7 hours, while roots in the plants where the gene was disabled managed less than 30 degrees in the same time. The plant has a compass for water, and it points downward when there is a gradient to follow. The name scientists use for this process is hydrotropism, root growth directed toward moisture. But the plain English version is this: your tomato's roots will chase water down into the soil, but only if the surface is dry enough to make deep water more attractive than shallow water. When you water daily, the surface stays wet, the gradient disappears, and the compass has nothing to point toward. The roots stay put. The navigation system idles. Week after week, the shallow mat thickens, and the plant builds exactly the root architecture that a heat wave destroys. The second thing to understand is what the soil does with heat when those roots are shallow. The top 5 to 10 centimeters of bare, unshaded soil on a hot July day can reach 45 to 55 degrees, hot enough to cook an egg on slowly, and hot enough to kill root tissue permanently. A tomato root is irreversibly damaged above about 40 to 45 degrees, and the damage happens within hours of exposure. What makes this especially cruel is the timing. The roots die underground on the hot afternoon, but the green leaves above have stored reserves that take 2 to 3 days to exhaust. So the plant looks perfectly fine on day 1 after the heat wave. It looks fine on day 2. On day 3, or the morning of day 4, you come out and find it wilted before the heat of the day has even started. Wilted in the cool morning air. By that point, the roots are already gone, and no amount of watering will bring them back. What does this mean for you right now? Every day you water the surface and keep those roots shallow, you are setting a timer on your plant's survival, and you will not see the countdown until it has already run out. There is one error that 9 out of 10 gardeners make when they first switch to deep watering, and it is the error that destroys the benefit of everything described above. The error is this: watering in response to midday leaf wilting. On hot afternoons above 28 or 30 degrees, your tomato plant does something that looks exactly like drought stress. The small pores on the underside of the leaves, the ones that let the plant breathe and exchange gases, close up to reduce water loss. When they close, the leaves lose their internal pressure and droop or curl. This is the plant protecting itself from heat. It is a normal, healthy response, and it has nothing to do with the soil being dry. But it looks identical to what a genuinely thirsty plant does. Every instinct you have as a gardener says, "The leaves are wilting, give it water." So you do. The surface gets wet again. The moisture gradient that was pulling the roots downward collapses, the navigation system goes back to idle, and the deep root system that was beginning to form, that was 3 or 4 days into building itself downward, resets to 0. The physical symptoms of this mistake arrive on a specific timeline. Within 8 to 10 days of responding to every midday wilt with a top-up watering, you are back to daily shallow watering without having made a conscious decision to go back. The roots, which had begun to extend toward the deeper moisture front, have returned to the surface where the water keeps appearing. The plant looks fine throughout this process. That is precisely why the mistake is invisible. There is no signal, no yellow leaf, no wilting in the morning. The only test that tells you whether your plant is genuinely thirsty or simply hot is the time of day. Check the leaves before 8 in the morning, before the day's heat has built. If the leaves are wilted and drooping before the sun is strong, that is real drought stress, and the plant needs water. If the leaves look normal in the morning and only curl when the afternoon temperature climbs, that is the plant doing its job. Put the can down, walk away. The gradient is forming underground exactly as it should. Write in the comments, did you water in response to midday wilting? Tell me your region. Let's see if there is a pattern.
Here is the full protocol.
And every step has a specific number attached, so you know exactly what to do tomorrow. First, stop watering completely for 3 to 4 consecutive days. Not a reduction in how much you water, a full stop. This is the step that feels most wrong, and it is the most important one. The slight stress your plant experiences during this pause is the activation signal for the root navigation system. The surface dries, the moisture gradient forms between the dry upper soil and the wetter deeper soil, and the compass activates and points down. Second, when you water, deliver 4 to 5 liters per plant slowly at the base of the stem, not overhead onto the leaves, not scattered across the bed. Slow delivery matters because it gives the water time to sink rather than run sideways. Pour, pause for 2 minutes, pour again. Your goal is moisture reaching 20 to 25 centimeters below the surface. Push a thin wooden skewer or a pencil into the soil the following morning. It should come out damp at that depth. If it comes out dry, add 1 more liter the next morning and test again. Third, after each deep watering, wait 3 to 4 days before watering again. The surface will dry out and look alarming by day 2. This is correct. The gradient is active. The roots are moving downward, and every top-up watering during this phase undoes the progress. Check for morning wilting before 8. That is your only real trigger for emergency watering between scheduled sessions. Fourth, lay 5 to 6 centimeters of mulch around each plant. Straw, dry cut grass, dry leaves, without piling it against the stem. Mulch cuts surface evaporation dramatically, keeps the soil temperature in the root zone down by 10 to 15 degrees on hot days, and extends the interval between necessary deep waterings. This step changes the environment around the roots even before the roots themselves have moved. Fifth, from this point forward, water only in the early morning or evening, never onto hot, dry soil in the afternoon heat, and never overhead onto the leaves. Water on hot, bare soil evaporates heavily before it penetrates. Water on leaves is the primary pathway for early blight and late blight spores to enter the plant. The correct target is always the soil at the base of the stem, in the cooler part of the day. A tomato plant that has completed 2 to 3 weeks of this protocol will have roots extending to 30 or 40 centimeters depth. And at that depth, the soil temperature on the hottest July day stays below 25 degrees, and moisture persists even when the top 10 centimeters are completely dry. The first time a heat wave arrives after you have made this change, you will walk out to your garden on a day that is 35 degrees in the shade and find your tomatoes standing without a mark on them, while the plants in the neighboring plot, still on daily shallow watering, are curling and dropping leaves by noon. Tomato roots in undisturbed soil, soil that has never been compacted by daily droplet impact, never been kept constantly moist at the surface, can reach 1.8 meters deep. Most gardeners will never see that, because the daily watering habit prevents it before it ever starts. But the capacity is there, built into the plant, waiting for the right conditions. The plant that reaches that depth can survive a 2-week drought without visible stress. The plant trapped in the top 10 centimeters can die in a single hot afternoon. Same seed, same soil, same gardener, different outcome, because of one habit repeated every morning. Everything you have heard so far fits together into one picture, not a list of separate lessons. The thirst signal activates the root compass. The root compass builds the deep architecture. The deep architecture puts roots below the kill zone. The mulch keeps the surface cool and extends the interval. These are not 4 separate techniques. They are one system, and the system works as a whole or not at all. When you water deeply and then wait,
You are not just saving water or reducing labor, though you are doing both. You are handing back to the plant a biological capacity it has always had, and that your daily watering was quietly suppressing. The tomatoes your family eats this summer will have come from a plant that was never fighting for survival in the top 5 centimeters of baked soil, never burning reserves just to cope with conditions you accidentally created. That is not a small thing. Consider what leaves your shopping list when you make this change. The fungicide rounds for blight. Gone, because dry foliage and deep roots mean the wet surface conditions that fungal spores need never form. The soil amendment products you have bought to compensate for compaction. Gone, because the mulch and the reduced droplet impact mean the surface crust never builds. The 30 hours of your summer spent carrying a can back and forth, cut in half. And the yield from the same plants, the same soil, the same seed you have always bought, up by somewhere between 20 and 35% in documented research trials. Your family gets more tomatoes. You spend less time, less money, and fewer mornings on an errand that was not helping. That is the full picture. Here's the choice you are holding right now, stated plainly. Path 1. Continue the daily watering. Continue spending those 30 hours of summer on the habit. Continue treating the fungal infections the wet surface encourages, and continue watching some plants collapse in July while others survive by luck, and you never understand why. Path 2. Put the watering can down for 4 days starting tomorrow. Deliver 4 to 5 liters slowly at the base of the stem on day 5. Lay down a layer of mulch, and let the roots do what the biology has always equipped them to do. Write in the comments, Path 1 or Path 2. And tell me your region while you were there. I want to know whether the pattern holds across different climates, because the research suggests it does, but the gardeners who write in are the ones who actually confirm it from their own beds. When you put your answer into words, you hear yourself making the decision out loud. That is when it becomes real and stays real. Your tomato plant is not asking for more water. It is asking for water in the right place, at the right depth, after a long enough pause to activate the signal that sends roots downward. Right now, there are roots in your soil that have been waiting for weeks for the surface to dry long enough to point them where they are trying to go. They have the compass built in. The only thing stopping them is the water you bring every morning before the surface has a chance to dry. Tomorrow you can choose differently. Put the can down. Let the surface dry. Let the roots go where they were always pointing. Down. Away from the heat, into the deep, cool layer where moisture waits through any July. The plant will not fail you when you do this. Go deep. Everything is down there.